So there's this really fascinating phenomenon in quantum physics known as the observer effect. And this effect is interesting for two reasons. The first is it shows that reality is much more malleable than we first thought. And the second reason is that it provides a potential mechanism for how manifestation might work. So if you want to understand the observer effect and learn how it might relate to the law of attraction, then keep watching. My name's Georgia. I have a master's degree in consciousness, spirituality and transpersonal psychology, and in my free time I love to research manifestation and the science behind shifting our reality. Now in today's video we're going to be diving into a very interesting phenomenon within quantum physics that might have everything to do with manifestation. So I'm going to explain exactly what the observer effect is, how it works, and exactly how it relates to manifestation, because there are a couple of lessons we can learn from it. So let's first look at what the observer effect actually is. So to understand how this works and what's happening, we first need to understand that quantum particles behave very weirdly. So quantum particles are simply particles at the quantum level, so subatomic particles, for example, like electrons and protons and neutrons. Now, the thing about quantum particles is they can exist in two overarching states. So the first state is called superposition. Now, superposition is a very weird state, and it essentially means the quantum particle is behaving as if it's in multiple states at once. This is obviously very strange. At the macro level that we exist at, nothing behaves as if it's in multiple states at the same time. Everything exists in a definite state. So this is kind of hard to wrap your head around, but let me give you an example just to try and visualize it a bit. So let's imagine we have a coin. Obviously this coin is not a quantum particle, but let's just pretend it is for the example. So when you have a coin, that coin has two sides, heads and tails. Now imagine you are tossing that coin and it's spinning in the air. When it's spinning, you can't tell if it is heads or if it's tails. It's like it's both and neither of them all at once. So use that state of the coin spinning in the air to try and somewhat visualize what quantum superposition is. Of course, actual quantum superposition is a lot more complicated, and to be honest, we can't really perceive, we can just see its effects. So what this means in practice is that quantum particles behave as if they're in multiple different states at the same time. So for example, there's an experiment called the double slit experiment, and in that experiment the quantum particles behave as if they're in two positions at the same time. But this can also apply to any of the different properties of a quantum particle. So superposition is the first overarching state that a quantum particle can be in, but the second overarching state that it can be in is simply a definite state. So this is what we would have expected in the first place, a particle essentially having a defined location in space and time, like we would expect of all physical objects. If I held a tennis ball here, that tennis ball has a defined location in time and space. It can't be in multiple places at the same time. So this second overarching state is simply that the quantum particle is in a definite state like we would expect. So if we go back to the coin example, we can imagine that the coin is in your hand, and that coin is obviously going to be on heads or tails. It's never going to be both at the same time. It's going to be one or the other because that coin has a definite state. So we have these two overarching states that quantum particles can be in, the first being superposition and the second being a definite state. Now, what experiments have shown, which is absolutely mind-blowing, is that what causes a quantum particle to transform from one state to the other is the act of taking a measurement. Specifically, these quantum particles will exist in the state of superposition, as if they're in multiple states at once, until a measurement is taken, and that causes them to take on a definite state. Now this transformation, this process, is known as the observer effect. So you might notice here I'm talking about measurement. It's the act of taking a measurement that has this effect, and that doesn't sound much like an observer. And this is because in quantum physics, observation means measurement. Observation doesn't necessarily have anything to do with a conscious observer, but this is what we're going to come on to next. So you might be wondering, how does all of this relate to manifestation? And the way it relates comes into one of the interpretations of what's going on here, because basically no one actually knows why taking a measurement has this effect, so there's lots of different interpretations about exactly what is the cause. And one of the interpretations is that it's actually something to do with the researcher's awareness that is causing this transformation to occur. So this kind of interpretation is called a consciousness collapse model, and the overarching idea is that it's something to do with consciousness itself that is causing quantum particles to transform from being in this state of a superposition to being in a definite state. So if this kind of interpretation is true, then it would mean that the observer effect doesn't just refer to the act of taking a measurement. Instead, it would mean that the observer effect could actually have something to do with an actual observer, some kind of conscious being who has consciousness. Of course, this kind of interpretation leaves many questions, the most obvious of which is perhaps, how can this happen? Quantum particles are obviously physical things, whereas consciousness itself, at least the subjective experience of it, is non-physical. So how can these two things interact? How can something non-physical have an actual tangible effect on something that's physical? Now, there is actually a very interesting model that was put forth by David Chalmers and Kelvin McQueen to try and answer this question of how consciousness could have a tangible effect on quantum particles. So I'm going to briefly explain that here. Now, to understand their model, we have to understand two concepts first. The first concept is superposition resistance. So we already talked about what superposition is. Essentially, it's the fact that quantum particles can behave as if they're in multiple states at once. So superposition resistance is simply the idea that some things might resist entering a superposition. In other words, they are always in a definite state, or if they do enter a superposition, then that superposition collapses quickly into a definite state because it resists the superposition. The second concept we need to understand is quantum entanglement. So quantum entanglement refers to the fact that when two quantum particles interact in some way and then become separated, they kind of have this underlying connection. So now their states will always be correlated. So you can think of it like these two particles are now linked. So if one of the particles is in a superposition, then the other particle is also in a superposition. But if one of those particles collapses into the definite state, then the other particle also collapses into a definite state. Both of their states have to be correlated. So what Chalmers and McQueen suggest in their model is that consciousness is superposition resistant. Now, this can either refer to the non-physical aspect of consciousness, the subjective experience of it, or it can refer to the physical correlates of consciousness, so the activity happening in the brain. So this model fits with whatever understanding you have about consciousness, but basically whether you refer to the physical or non-physical aspects of consciousness, then Chalmers and McQueen suggest that that is superposition resistant. So consciousness resists superposition. So essentially the idea is that it can enter a superposition, but that superposition is unstable and collapses quickly into a definite state. Now, to understand how this could mean that consciousness is the cause of the observer effect, we have to understand that consciousness in this model becomes entangled with some quantum system. So we've already just talked about entanglement. We now know that consciousness and this quantum system are correlated. Their states have to be the same. So when consciousness becomes entangled with this quantum system, which is in a superposition, consciousness also enters a superposition because their states are correlated. So again, this can either be the non-physical aspect of consciousness, or it can be the physical correlates, or both. But the point is that consciousness also enters a superposition. But because consciousness is superposition resistant, then that superposition collapses quickly. And because it is entangled with the quantum system, then the quantum system also has to collapse. So now both of them collapse into a definite state. So this transformation that we've been talking about throughout the video, going from a state of superposition to a definite state, the observer effect, which in the observer effect is usually caused by the act of taking a measurement, in this model, we can now see how this could actually be caused by consciousness itself. So that's all of the theory. I now just want to look at again how this relates to manifestation. You might notice here that this model we've just talked about, it relies on consciousness resisting superposition. It relies on it collapsing into a definite state. Now, this is very interesting to me because one of the main manifestation teachings is that we have to focus on our desire. We need to saturate our mind with whatever it is that we want to manifest. We don't want to be constantly doubting our manifestation or our focus to keep shifting back to what we don't want. Basically, we want laser focus on what it is that we're trying to manifest. We don't want our mind scattered everywhere. So when it comes to manifestation, we want a defined state of consciousness, one that is aligned with whatever it is that we're trying to manifest. And this is something I know from my own experience of manifestation as well. Whenever I have desired something and I've managed to get into a state where I have full faith and such a strong belief that that thing is going to manifest, so strong that I would rarely have doubts come up, then those were always the times that my manifestations came to me the most quickly. In my experience, the most effective way to manifest is to have the most unwavering faith in your desire. Now, the model I talked about is obviously theoretical, and there's obviously a difference between quantum superposition versus a definite state, and us just having scattered thoughts versus being focused on our desires. But the correlation here is certainly interesting. So even if this model doesn't provide a definite mechanism for manifestation, it is definitely a very useful metaphor. So I think there are two key lessons we can learn from the observer effect, and in extension, the consciousness collapse model that provides one interpretation of it. So the first lesson is that reality exists in a state of multiple possibilities until something causes one state to be selected. So this all comes back to quantum superposition. Reality is not deterministic. At the quantum level, multiple possibilities exist at once. So imagine what this could mean for your life. That reality that you're trying to create, those dreams that you're trying to manifest, they might already exist as potential, just waiting for you to select them. So the second lesson we can learn from the observer effect, if we assume the consciousness collapse model to be true, then it might have something to do with you maintaining a defined state of consciousness that causes one of those possibilities to collapse and be realized. And by the way, we don't even have to just rely on that theoretical model, because there are other scientific concepts which back up this idea. So first we can look to neuroscience, because there's so much evidence that our brain basically works like a filter. Essentially, our brain is constantly taking in information from our outside environment, and it's too much to pay attention to at once, so our brain has to filter it and choose what we pay attention to. And it does this through various mechanisms, but essentially we can harness these mechanisms through deciding what we pay attention to and cultivating our own belief system that is in alignment with the reality we're trying to manifest. By doing these things, we train our brain to filter in information that is in alignment with the reality we're trying to manifest. There's also the placebo effect, which is direct proof that our beliefs can have physical effects in our body in alignment with those beliefs. So quantum physics kind of just takes that a bit further and says that we might actually be able to have an effect outside of our body and actually on physical reality too. So there's so much evidence out there that what we focus on is incredibly important when it comes to creating our reality. So make sure you are focusing on what you want to experience. You need to create such a strong belief in the reality that you're trying to manifest, so that your thoughts aren't constantly wavering, so that doubts aren't constantly coming up. Of course, this requires inner work too. You can't just try and force yourself to pay attention to what you do want. You do have to address the doubts that are coming up, because they are revealing to you that there are some limiting beliefs you need to heal and shift. But the observer effect and these other scientific concepts I've just mentioned are incredible evidence that what you focus on can have a huge impact when it comes to manifesting your desires. So if you want to go even deeper and learn about the experiment that gave rise to the observer effect, as well as go into the consciousness collapse model that I talked about in much more detail, then you can watch this video here. If now you want actionable steps on exactly how you can manifest, then you can watch this video here. For now, I really hope you found this video interesting. Please give it a thumbs up if you did. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.